Hey, so as we all know, the College Board has gotten rid of pencils and paper and has decided to go completely digital. Now, the College Board is going to, in terms of time frame, the College Board is going to roll out the digital SAT in 2 phases. So phase 1, known as the International SAT phase, rolls out in the spring of 2023. Right, while the second phase is the US SAT, which rolls out in the spring of 2024. Hey guys, my name is Jin, and I'll be your teacher, your coach, and your trainer throughout this course. Now guys, I am a top 1%er when it comes to all things grammar. So whether that's on the SAT, the ACT, or even the GMAT, I've been able to score in the top 99th percentile for all of these exams. Right, to add to this, right, I'm also an author of a 500-page grammar textbook, which is currently in editing, and a content creator, right, for thousands of practice questions, right, for the SAT and the ACT exams. I've spent the last 20 years of my life dedicated to the education space, right, whether this is in personal tutoring, working at schools, right, or even living the last 12 years in Korea, working with over 7,000 students, I've devoted my life, the last 20 years of my life, right, to really helping students, right, excel academically. Now guys, I also have a background in psychology, and I love to, right, one of my passions is to integrate aspects of positive psychology into my teaching. So you'll kind of see that, if you know anything about positive psychology, you'll see that kind of spread out or sprinkled right throughout this course. Now guys, I've taken all of that knowledge and all of the observations over the last 20 years of my experiences, right, to create what I believe is a pretty darn good writing course for the digital SAT. So this course is named or titled the Writing Foundations course. Now there are a couple of things, you guys, that I do have to clarify, right, about this course. And in order to do that, I have to talk a little bit about the format for the digital SAT test, right, which is what I want to do here. Now guys, I think the first thing that you have to know is this course is only covers the writing portion of the digital SAT. Right? So what do I mean by that? Let me explain. So the digital SAT exam, you guys, right, is going to, the first section is going to incorporate questions from both the reading and the writing sections. So what that basically means is you're going to have reading comprehension style questions and writing style questions in the same section. You'll be given 32 minutes, right, to answer 27 of both reading and writing questions. Now about half of the questions, right, are dedicated to the reading style questions, and about half of the questions are writing style questions. And in terms of how these questions are administered, well, you'll be given one short passage, anywhere from about 1 to 3 sentences long, right, which corresponds to, right, just one question. So guys, if you know anything about the past SAT, like you'll know the format, right, is pretty different, okay? So let me actually kind of tell you a little bit more specifically about what this course, right, that covers the writing section, offers. So guys, the way that I approach grammar or the writing portion is I like to kind of separate or categorize, right, the writing style questions into 3 sort of big categories. I call them 3 big buckets. That first big bucket is punctuation questions. Right? The second one is grammar style questions, and the third one is what I call rhetoric questions. Rhetoric just means the art or the style of writing. Now within each of these big buckets, we have what are called subtopics. Right? So think about subtopics as being like smaller concepts that fall under the umbrella of punctuation. So when it comes to punctuation, there are 9 subtopics, 9 punctuation marks that we have to know very, very well on this test. Now guys, let me go one step further, right, is each of these punctuation marks has their own separate rules, their own separate do's and don'ts that you have to learn very well. So you can start to get a sense, right, of how much knowledge or how much information you need, right, just to be able to, right, do well on the writing portion of the digital SAT. right? There are many other types of reading comprehension style questions, and there are specific strategies and concepts and tools and stuff that you need to know for those, right? But just for the writing section, you can kind of see how comprehensive, right, of a part of the test that it is already, right? It's not to mention, you guys, once you start getting into the grammar questions, right, we have 4 subtopics there, right? These grammar concepts, sentence structure, right, verbs, pronouns, and modifiers, and there's different ways that the SAT will test you, right, on each of these concepts, right? And so you can tell how dense, right? So even though there are like 3 just general categories of questions, it's not that students are just learning 3 things. Within each of these categories, right, there are smaller subcategories, and within each smaller subcategory, there are more concepts and more lessons that they have to learn, right? And so you can really tell, right, how comprehensive this section is. And so really what I've done is I've kind of broken up, right, this one big test, right, called the writing section, and really broken it down into smaller pieces, right, where each of these pieces is then broken down into a smaller piece, right? So we're taking this one big thing, breaking it down into smaller and smaller and smaller parts. And what I do, right, is I kind of teach one part at a time to help build up, right, students' knowledge, right, one piece at a time, right? And so that's really based off of a psychological principle, right, that's really at the core of my teaching philosophy, right, which is what I call deconstructing to reconstruct, but we don't have time to get into that today. Now, guys, the reason that I created the course like this, right, is really because of who I created the course for. I always tell my students this is, guys, I am the kind of teacher who not only loves teaching, but I also love learning. And one of the things that I love learning about my students, right? Not just like academically, but also like psychologically, right? I love learning the psychographics of students, right? And over the last 12 years spending time in Korea, I've been fortunate enough and honored enough, right? I've been honored to be able to work with over 7,000, right, students. And each of these students, I still remember some of my students' names and their faces and their characteristics and their traits, right, from when I first got here 12 years ago, and what I basically do, and I realized I was doing this kind of unconsciously, but I kind of categorize, right, students based on types, right? So this type of student has these characteristics. So if this type of student has these characteristics, I got to teach them in this way. This type of student is kind of more like this, right? So if this person, is motivated by, fear, then I got to be mean, right? If this person or if this student is motivated by, kindness and positive energy, then I got to reinforce that. I got to tell them, hey, great job, right, on effort, and so I love to kind of categorize students based off of that, right? It's really because I'm really trying to be the kind of teacher who's able to kind of help any type of student though, right? And what I've basically done when I created this course was really focus on, right, who are my primary targets, right? Who are my primary students that I want to reach, right? I've kind of been able to categorize them into 3 different I call these student profiles, right? And so here, that first one is the test newbie. And these are just silly terms, you guys, yeah? Just make them a little bit more memorable. If you're not sure what a newbie is, just ask your kid. Your kid will probably call you a noob, right, for not knowing what a newbie is. We also have what's known as the untrained test taker. And the third sort of student profile is what I call the early birds. Okay, and so I'll talk about each of these guys to kind of tell you guys a little bit more about their characteristics to see if your child kind of fits into, right, one of these student profiles. Now, the first of the main type of student that I've designed this course for is that test newbie. Okay, so some of the characteristics for a test newbie is that these guys have no prior SAT experience, nor have they ever studied grammar formally. Okay, now if you want to check to see if, right, if your child has studied grammar formally, just simply ask them a question. Ask your child if they can explain to you, right, the different ways that you should use commas in the English language. Okay, so there's a lot of them. So if your child's like, well, I'm not sure, right? If they can't kind of articulate that or explain that to you, then you know they haven't really studied grammar formally. Okay. Also, if your child's not familiar with grammar terms like independent clauses or modifying phrases or sentence structure or run-on sentences, fragments, right? These are also signs to me that, hey, they need this course. Okay. Also, this type of student, kind of went a little bit early there, they can communicate in the English language fluently. So we can have a conversation with each other, right? But, right, they really lack a lot of confidence when it comes to English, the English language, specifically with grammar, right? So there's a question that I always ask all of my grammar students, and that is, guys, on a scale of 1 to 10, like how confident are you with grammar? You know, so most students, I would say like maybe 90% of students, even though they're in a 실전 level class, I would say like 90% of students will give me an answer or a number below 5, which isn't very confident, right? I've heard some answers as ridiculous as -3, -1,000, right? But a lot of them will tell me that, hey, they're not very confident, right, with their grammar abilities, right, is all. Also, this type of student, they hate learning too many things at once. So these guys believe, right, that focus is power, and they love to focus on one thing at a time. It really allows them to kind of learn things much better, right? As opposed to learning 10 things at once, they love focusing on one thing and learning that thing really well and then moving on to that next thing. This is a sort of core philosophy of how I love to learn, right? So it's how I teach, right, as well. Focusing on one thing at a time. And the last sort of characteristic for these guys, you guys, yeah, they're proactive, right? Which is they're not just passively listening to me and not even taking notes. Maybe they have YouTube on. Maybe they're watching a YouTube video on their phone while they're listening to my lectures. These guys aren't that type of person, right? If you are, this course isn't for you because you have to pay attention. If you're not paying attention, right, you're going to miss a lot of things because there's a lot of things that I give or explain and I go in depth. And so if you're zoning in and out of these lessons, you're not going to really see very much improvement, and I don't really want to work with that type of student anyways though. But if you are very proactive, if you're very active in your learning, if you don't understand, so examples of active learners or proactive learners, these are guys who, when they don't understand something, they'll pause the video and they'll go rewind it and watch it again, maybe 3 times. If they still don't understand what I'm saying, they'll pause the video, they'll write down a question to make sure that they ask me later. Simple examples of proactive kids, right? Like if your child has like these characteristics, you guys, they're going to excel, right, in this course. Like they need this class. That second, so this is the test, newbie, right? The test noob. The second student profile is the untrained test taker, right? So it kind of is what it sounds like, right? So these guys do have some prior test prep experience. Maybe they've studied the older SAT, right? Or maybe they have SSAT experience, right? But their defining characteristic is they really struggle to improve their scores. So even though they've enrolled in a course, right, 3 months long, right, 6 months long, their scores don't improve very much. That's what I call an untrained test taker. It's not that they don't have experience, it's just they don't have the proper training. Is all, right? So these guys are often unsure when they're solving English questions, right? So they'll choose answers based on feel rather than based on fact, right? So 느낌적으로, right? They'll kind of choose an answer because that's what they feel like is correct though, right? But they cannot articulate or explain very well why that's the case, right? Falls under this category here. These guys also have no mental framework for how to solve questions. So they're very disorganized or 정신없어 in terms of their process, right? They have no process. So these types of students, you guys, basically their thinking is, okay, the question, what's the answer? Question, answer. As opposed to what do I have to do first, right? What do I have to do second, third, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so these guys, this type of student, right, just has no sort of process or methodology, right, for solving questions. This course is perfect for them, right? As well as, these students also take way too much time, right, to solve grammar questions. So if your child has had some SAT experience, right, but struggles with time. So if your child has enrolled in a previous SAT course, right, the older SAT, and they struggle to finish on time or they feel like they don't have a lot of time, right, in the writing sections, Yeah, it's oftentimes because, right, they are spending way too much time, right, solving these grammar questions though, okay, is all. And so that's that sort of second, bucket of student, that second student profile. That third one, you guys, the third or the tertiary sort of customer, tertiary student profile is what I call the early birds, right? So the early birds are the guys, right, often younger. These guys are the guys who want to get a head start, right? So oftentimes these guys are the younger kids, right? Seventh, eighth, ninth graders, right? And these guys are very fluent in the English language. So again, we can have a conversation with each other, right? Maybe we can talk about, I don't know, movies, vacations, whatever it might be though, right? But we can have conversations fluidly, right, with each other. Yeah, and they can also follow, right, my English speed, yeah, and my explanation style. Okay, so even though they're young, right, they're pretty knowledgeable, right? They're pretty adept at the English language. Okay. Also, you guys, I think the defining characteristic for early birds, though, is these guys are high achievers. So these guys, not only do they want the best, not only do they want to be the best, but they've also actually achieved, right, some of the things that are beyond, right, their current age group or their age cohort. Right. So if you have a sixth grader who's maybe enrolled in eighth grade or ninth grade debate, right? If you have a seventh grader, right, who's in a sort of English class with like ninth or 10th graders, right? So that's a sort of defining characteristic of early birds. It's not that they just want to be the best, but it's also that they've actually achieved certain things English related, right, that can allow them to, that really shows that they can kind of follow, right, the speed of learning, yeah, or the depth of learning, right, in this course. Okay, if your child is a seventh grader and wants to be good, but just watches TV 10 hours a day, this course isn't for them. Okay, it's not for the lazy young kids. It's for the people who've achieved, but also want to achieve more. So these are guys oftentimes who want to score in the top 99th percentile, right, on the grammar section. These guys also want to improve their grammar knowledge and become a better writer and a reader. Okay, they want to just be better for the sake of being better. They find value, right? They find inherent value in reading and writing, yeah, and they know that the more they learn, right, the more the better they are as readers and writers, and they know that that's valuable because reading and writing is a skill, right, that you're going to need for the rest of your life, right? If your young child has an understanding of that, that's amazing. And also you guys, right? These guys, right? They want to impress their teachers and their friends, right? They want to, and even their parents, even you guys, right? So your child wants to come home and say, hey, mom, look at this A, right, on this essay that I got, right? This essay that I wrote. Hey, my teacher told me this is like the best essay, and he's going to use this as an example, right, to show other kids what proper grammar looks like, right? That's these guys, okay? Maybe not to that extreme or that degree, but you guys get an idea, right, of what I'm talking about, right? Like you have to have some ability, right, if you're young, right, and you have to have some kind of drive or ambition, right, because the actual digital SAT is many, many years away, right? So that's sort of defining characteristics of this sort of target customer though, right? Now, so these are the sort of three student profiles, right, in which I've kind of created this course. Now, so guys, we've talked about the what, right? Like what this course, what's in this course. We've also talked about the who, right? Like who this course is for. Now I want to kind of get into the how. Right, so the how here is I really want to get into like how I designed this course, okay? Now, how I designed this course, you guys, is based off of my observations and experiences, right? I've identified three major problems, right? I believe these are the three biggest problems for untrained test takers. Yeah, and so students who have a hard time taking tests, right, these are the three main issues that they have. Yeah, and basically, based off of these three problems, I've come up with specific solutions, right, to kind of solve each of these problems. Okay, and so just kind of introducing to you guys what those three problems are, and then we'll kind of take a look at what they look like in a little bit more detail. So that first, the biggest problem, you guys, is ignorance. Think about this as like lack of knowledge, right? You don't know what you don't know, right? So the way that we want to solve or get rid of ignorance is with knowledge, yeah? The second biggest problem, you guys, is what I call blind spots, right? We all have them, right? We can't see what we can't see, right? And we can't do what we can't see, right? And so if you can't see it, you're going to be guessing your way throughout that test, right? It's something that I always say to my kids, right? And so the way that we solve blind spots, you guys, right, is with awareness, right? And so there's going to be aspects around this course, right, that really help you to see, right, what you need to see to get to the correct answer. And the last or the biggest problem, another big problem, you guys, is disorganization. The 정신없는 people, so people who are very, very disorganized, right, is all. So these guys don't have any sort of process, right, or these guys are just like in 멘붕 mode or panic mode, right, from the start of the test to the end of the test. They're never really that present. The way that we solve disorganization is with process, right, it's explaining methodology, like the how-to, right, solve different types of questions though, okay? So kind of getting into each of these problems, you guys, right? So that first problem of ignorance, so the lack of knowledge. So these types of students though, right, their biggest problem is that they choose answers based on intuition, right, based on their feel, right, rather than on facts. And they're always kind of uncertain, right, is all, yeah? So the way I kind of solved that, or how I created this course, is to kind of solve this issue by giving you what I call the facts, right, the knowledge piece is all. So this is where we have a lot of the teaching that's involved. The teaching is really where I kind of teach, right, or kind of give you the knowledge, right? And so this is where you'll learn, right, all the grammar terminology, right? You'll learn all the grammar punctuation rules, right? As well as you'll know how to choose answers with confidence, right? You'll know how to do that though, right? Because we're going to be choosing our answers based on facts about grammar, not based on feelings is all. Okay? That second issue, you guys, right, is blind spots, right? We can't see what we can't see. So these are types of students, untrained test takers, these guys don't know what to look for, right? They think that every single grammar question is exactly the same, right? And so because they think it's the same, they have they don't have a heightened sense of awareness, right? They treat all words or all punctuation marks in a question, in a passage, to be the same. They're all of equal importance. Right? That's really what having blind spots means when it comes to taking this test, right? So these guys end up, feeling stuck or just really guessing. So when I ask these guys a question and I ask them why they chose this, I don't know. I don't know, right, is all, yeah? So the way that we kind of get rid of blind spots is we help you to see, right? We help you to see. The way that we help you to see is through awareness, right, is all, yeah? So these are you guys, right? Where I kind of, this is also part of the teaching part of the course, right? Where I do, and a little bit of the training, right? Is I do kind of let you know, right, what I call the context clues. So context clues are just like, hey, the types of details that are more important for that type of writing question, right? So if you have a punctuation question that's based on a question mark, there are certain types of context clues, certain words in the passage that are more important, right, than other words. I call these context clues, right? And you have different types of context clues for each type of question, is the idea, right? So this is really designed to help you to see better, help you to recognize, right, that, hey, some things are more important than other things, right? And this is where the sort of training part kind of comes into play, right? Is I kind of help you, I kind of train you, right, through repetition, yeah, through repetition, is I kind of train you to recognize what really is important, right, is all. And the last sort of issue, without taking too much of your time, you guys, yeah, is disorganization, right? So these types of students, though, is they have no process. So they do things really, really randomly in a very sort of 정신없어 and very disorganized way, right? So these guys often end up being very confused. And it's because of how they're doing it, right? It's not because of their lack of English ability, it's because of the lack of process, right, is all, yeah? So the way we kind of get rid of or, kind of solve or reconcile disorganization is through process. This is where sort of the training aspect kind of comes in, right, I'll teach you guys, you'll learn the step-by-step sort of methods, the step-by-step processes for how to solve each of these questions, right? So even when we have like one specific question type, like a verb, right? There's specific ways to, there's like specific step-by-step ways to kind of think through, right? Verb questions is all, yeah? So you'll be kind of exposed to all of that sort of stuff, right? Throughout this course, yeah? And that's the sort of idea here, you guys, okay? So this is all to kind of say, you guys, right? Is if you want your child to have massive confidence, right? With English grammar, and if you want your child to be able to unleash that confidence when solving tests, you don't want them to feel fear or feel afraid when they're taking a test, but you want them to feel more certain and prepared, right? If you also believe that it's not only important to know, but it's also very important to know how, right? I think we live in a society or an age, you guys, right, where we have too much information, right? So the knowledge isn't really the issue. It's really, I think that we really need to start learning how to do stuff though, right? So if you believe what I believe here, you know, if you believe that it's not important just to know, but you also need to know how, right? And lastly, you guys, yeah, if you want your child to be able to actuate his potential, to be able to maximize his score, you guys, yeah, not just through the knowledge, the facts and the strategies, right, but also with the mindset, right, and sort of emotional regulation, right, how to think and feel right throughout the test, you guys, yeah, then I think that this course is for you, and I'd love for you guys to start your journey, and I hope that you guys do, and I hope that I do see you guys, right, in that next video, right, where the course begins. Guys, it was a pleasure talking to you. 25 minutes. One thing you're going to know about me and my teaching, you guys, is I kind of tend to go long, right? So I planned for this video to be about 15 minutes long. It's about 25 minutes long. Anyways, I hope you guys learned something. I hope to see you guys soon. Take care, you guys. Hey, my amazing all-star student. Welcome back to your D.SAT Writing Foundations classroom, where I teach you to master the grammar fundamentals to help take you from stuck, unsure, unconfident to unstoppable, right, on this new D.SAT test. Guys, I am your coach, Jin, and today I'm very excited for today's lesson. We're coming off of the heels of these last 4 lessons, right, that were really the building blocks, the foundations of grammar, right, especially on this new SAT. We talked about those different parts of a sentence, and the most important takeaway for you guys, or that should have been for you guys for those 4 lessons, is for you guys to be able to identify, to be able to recognize, right, when these parts appear in any sentence, right? And the reason for that is because for today's lesson, we're going to start getting into the actual, specific details and grammar concepts that the SAT tests you on. So today we're going to start with punctuation marks, right? But in order for you guys to know, or in order for you guys to master these questions, you have to really first be able to recognize those different parts of a sentence that we talked about from that previous 4 classes, right? Which is why those first 4 intro lectures were so important. They are truly foundational, because all of these other concepts from this point forth are going to be building on that foundation, if that makes sense, okay? So today, we're going to talk about punctuation and how I like to kind of synthesize, right, everything that we talked about from the last 4 lectures and today is really, guys, honest to God truth of how we actually go from something very simple, like a very simple sentence with just one simple independent clause like this, right? Jill ordered a cheeseburger, right? Going from that simple sentence to a very complex, complicated one with many moving parts and pieces like the following, right? Although she was advised by her nutritional coach, a world-renowned health expert, to avoid eating junk food, Jill ordered a cheeseburger with extra cheese, mayonnaise, and 2 extra beef patties. Right, so the way we go from something very simple like this with just one IC, notice the punctuation as well, there's only one, right? To something very complex with a lot of different parts like this, notice the punctuations here, there's a lot, right? So how we go from something simple to complex is by using punctuation marks, right? Now, there are, by the way, this is grammatically correct. Yeah, and on the SAT, there are 9 punctuation marks that you have to master. Keyword is master. Not kinda, sorta, no, right? But you have to be able to master these things though, right? And the 9 punctuation marks, look up here, you guys. Actually, I shouldn't have. Let me hide that for a second, right? Let me ask you guys this question. Well, what are all the different punctuation marks that you know, right? Let me see if those what you know kind of matches up with what you have to know for the SAT. Okay, so think about it, try to spit them out, shout them out, right? We have what? We have commas, we have periods, we have semicolons, we have colons, we have dashes, right? 1 dash, 2 dashes. We have parentheses, we have question marks, and we have quotation marks and apostrophes. So these are the 9 different punctuation marks that you'll need to master, not just kind of, sort of, no, but master, right? To be able to score excellently on the SAT, okay? So your job, right, with this next few lessons, this big chapter on punctuation, your job is on the SAT to be able to determine, right, which punctuation is appropriate for that given sentence, right? So you're going to be given some sentence with an underlined part, right? And you're going to have 4 different answer choices. Each of these answer choices are going to utilize, right, a different punctuation or have the same punctuation but in a different place in the answer choice, right? Now your job is to figure out, right, which punctuation is appropriately used, right? So only one of them is going to create what's called a grammatical sentence. A grammatical sentence just means a sentence that follows all the rules of grammar. So that could include punctuation marks as well, right? Following those rules as well, right? Yeah, so your job is to kind of choose the answer, right, that is grammatical. And there's only going to be one, right? So that's basically what you're going to be tested on. Yeah, now what you have to kind of know and be able to do, right? So this is where your knowledge and skill sets, right, that you have to develop kind of come in, right? So one, you have to learn, you guys, the punctuation rules extremely well. So one of the things that I always tell my students, right, is you have to learn them so well that you make the information yours, right? 자기 거 만들어야 돼. Right, so you have to make the information yours, right? So it's not enough just to be like, oh yeah, I kind of know it, I've heard it before, right? But when it's time for you to apply that knowledge, you can't. You have to force yourself to think about it, right? That's not making the information yours, right? So right now, you guys, right? All of this sort of rules and grammar concepts and this information, these facts that I'm going to teach you about grammar, right now, this is all mine. This is all my knowledge, right? You have to get to the point where you make this stuff that I'm about to teach you yours, okay? And so that's where, you want to be constantly kind of testing yourself, right? Reviewing, right? After these lessons, right? Pause it and think about it. Just sit down in your chair and think about it for like 10 or 15 minutes. Well, what did I learn, right? What were some of the main punctuation rules, right, that Jin coach talked about, right? That's what I want you guys to do. That's the knowledge part of this test. Right, but it's not enough just to know, we have to know how, right? We have to know how to as well, right? So we have to be able to apply that knowledge, but not just apply it every so often, right? So that you kind of maybe only miss like 4 out of 10 questions. No, we want to be able to apply this knowledge so consistently, right? Time and time again, right? So that you don't miss any of these grammar questions on the test, no matter how difficult the question is, okay? Guys, the truth of the matter is, for this new digital SAT, it's an adaptive test, right? Which it's partly adaptive. It's not truly adaptive, but it's partly adaptive. So basically what that means is how you score, right, on that first part of the test, right, is going to determine which sort of level test you get for the second part of the test. Right, so if you don't score very well on the first part of the test for the reading and the writing section, then you're going to get the easier version, right, for the second part of the test. You might be thinking, yeah, I want easy. Well, that's not good. Because if you get the easy version of the test, your score can only max out at a certain number, right? Maybe in the 600s or so, right? So in order for you guys to score that 700 to, that 700 to 800 range, right, you have to put yourself in a position where you are taking that more advanced, the harder level, right, that harder second part, right, of that test, okay? And the only way for you to do that is to really master these grammar concepts, right? This grammar portion is a portion of the test that you can truly take advantage of, right? Because a lot of this stuff is just factual, right? A lot of this stuff is just like stuff that it's just true. It just is the way that it is in the English language. So a lot of this stuff you can kind of memorize, right? And you can, as long as you kind of like apply it and practice enough times, right, you won't have a hard time with punctuation. Right? In the beginning, this concept is probably the most challenging concept for most students, right? But once they actually truly master it, it becomes the easiest. Especially for kids who take my class, I really, really stress, right, being really good at these punctuation questions though, okay? Anyways, with that kind of being said, you guys, right, we're gonna hop into the first set of punctuation marks that we're gonna look at. Now, how I teach punctuation marks, right, is I like to kind of group them. Right, so sometimes I'll kind of group them based on two different punctuation marks that kind of serve similar purposes, right, like today. Other times I'll kind of group them, based on the sort of rules, right, for the punctuation marks. And you'll kind of see what I mean as we kind of progress through the next few lessons, okay? But for today's lesson, you guys, we're gonna focus on 2 punctuation marks, the period and semicolons, right? So a lot of you guys are familiar with the period, right? These periods are the guys that you kind of add, you kind of chiga to the end of like almost all sentences, right, that you read, right? Except for sentences that have like a question, in which case you'll use like a question mark, or a sentence that has like an exclamation, right, where you're actually shouting it, right, where you have an exclamation point as opposed to a period though. But most of you guys are familiar with periods, actually all of you guys should be, right, because that's how you guys write essays and stuff, right? Most of you guys almost always use periods, right? You guys should. Otherwise, something's wrong, right, with the way that you're learning the English language. Anyways, not everyone's comfortable or familiar with semicolons, right? So the way that I want to teach this to you guys is kind of grouping them kind of together. Okay, so let's jump into it, you guys, yeah? So first of all, you guys, the first rule that you have to know for semicolons is that semicolons are used to connect two ICs. Right, remember what ICs are, right? Independent clauses. Hey, welcome back, team. Welcome back to your D.SAT Writing Foundations classroom, where I teach you or help you to master those grammar fundamentals to help take you from stuck and unsure to unstoppable, right, on this test. Guys, today we're going to kind of expand on, right, let's talk about punctuations by talking about commas. Now, commas, you guys, right, this is going to be the most challenging punctuation to master simply because there are so many rules, so many do's and don'ts, right, for commas, right, in terms of how they can be used, yeah? We're going to be talking about, in these next 2 lessons, we're going to be talking about 10 to 15 different rules for commas. And what I mean by rules for commas, you guys, are basically like comma do's and comma don'ts. In other words, this is how commas can be used or should be used, right? And this is how commas should not be used, okay? So in other words, it should be like, do use commas in this way, do not use commas in this way, okay? And this is gonna be the sort of hardest lesson again, simply because there's so many things to remember. The tip that I would give you here, you guys, when it comes to mastering commas, this punctuation, is really focus on just learning the comma rules one rule at a time. Just one rule at a time, right? So learn the comma rules one at a time until you make that one rule yours. Once you make it yours, move on to that next rule, right? Make that rule yours, so on and so forth though, okay? There's another little tip that I'll teach you here in terms of how to group commas, right? Think about commas in groups or chunks as opposed to just randomly. It's a cool little psychological trick that can help you to remember things better though, okay? Now, the first thing about commas, you guys, yeah, is this. This is the thing that you want to be most aware of, right? Be very careful about this point, you guys, yeah? Commas are not only used, right? Or they're not always and only used anywhere a pause can occur. Some of you guys might have heard this or learned this from your previous teacher somewhere, right? But teacher can sometimes just like mistakenly say, oh yeah, well just put a comma whenever the writer wants you to pause. Right? Now, although that is true sometime, it's not always the case. And if you take that mindset into the test where, hey, a comma can be used anywhere a pause can occur, you're gonna run into a lot of trouble. Right? Now, the reason why is, take a look at this example sentence here. If I just paused where this comma was, right, the sentence would still read fine, right? So if I read it like this, I waited at the bus stop for over 3 hours to pick up my mom. You guys would be like, oh, there's nothing wrong with that, right? We can put a comma here because a pause there is appropriate, right? It can be used, right? Don't think like that. If you think in that way, you're gonna make a ton of mistakes, right, on this test. Okay, another example, you guys. Teachers and students alike gathered at the school to celebrate. Okay, now here's the thing. When I'm giving a speech, when I'm giving a presentation, I can use pauses for effect. Right, so if I say, teachers and students alike, they gathered at the school to celebrate. If I say it like that, I'm doing that for effect. But just because I'm pausing in my speech, right, doesn't mean that I should put a comma there in my writing, is all. Okay? So the fact of the matter is, you guys, both of these examples would be ungrammatical, right? And the thing that you have to understand about commas is that commas have very specific rules, very specific laws that they have to follow. Okay, now your job is to learn each of those laws, each of the do's and don'ts really well, right? And again, I'll give you some sort of tips. The way that I organized these two lessons will help you to kind of think about comma rules in a very organized way anyways, okay? So I've kind of done the sort of dirty work for you guys with the organization of this information in a way that makes sense logically. Yeah, so that's how I want you to kind of learn it though, okay? Now after this lesson, I definitely want you guys to always be kind of like testing yourself. Like just be quizzing yourself, right? Like be like, okay, well, hey, what are some of the comma rules? Let me try to see if I can list them. That's what I want you guys to kind of be doing or thinking about, right? After you listen to this lecture as well as like the next few lectures based on commas though, okay? Let's jump into it. So guys, the first comma rule. And here's the thing, a lot of you guys know a lot of these comma rules anyways. Again, you guys weren't born yesterday. You guys aren't learning English for the very first time in your lives. Most of you guys go to school abroad in America. Most of you guys go to really good schools in America, right? The fact of the matter is, you probably haven't learned grammar formally, right? And so there's a lot of like uncertainty. Like you're not sure, right? You're not fully confident if, you know, you're using punctuations in the right way. Right, but a lot of you guys kind of intuitively know it, right? So some of these rules you guys already know, and that's great. If you already know it, learn it better, right? And remember, the SAT doesn't test you on every single comma rule, right? They only test you on a certain number of comma rules, right? So learn those, right? Know those well, because just understand that the SAT can and probably will test you on these comma rules. So the first comma rule, you guys, is we want to use a comma and a fanboy's word to connect two ICs. Okay, so here the general pattern is going to be IC, comma, and fanboys IC. Notice here, you guys, right? Notice how I said a comma and a fanboy's word. I'm not saying a comma or a fanboy's word. I'm saying a comma and a fanboy's word. In fact, underline that word and, right, and really emphasize it. You have to have a comma and a fanboy's word, right, to properly connect two independent clauses. If you only have one or the other, that's not a grammatical sentence. Okay, so for example, here I say, well, Jack is a boy, comma, and Jill is a girl. Of course, when I read it, I'm not reading it like comma and, right, but that's what I'm observing, right? Observe the comma and I read the and. Jack is a boy, comma, observation, and Jill is a girl, right? So that's how I would be kind of like reading it and while making observations. But notice how I have the comma and the fanboys, right? Here, if I just had either or, so for example, if I just had the and got rid of the comma, this would not be a grammatical sentence. It would be ungrammatical. Jack is a boy and Jill is a girl. Even though it sounds fine, it's not grammatically correct. Why? Because we have to have a comma and a fanboy's word, not a comma or a fanboy's word though, okay? Keep that in mind, you guys. Very, very important. And remember, if you're not familiar, if you forgot what the fanboys were, I mentioned it last lecture, it's the 7 coordinating conjunctions, right? F stands for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, right? The 7 coordinating conjunctions in the English language. These guys can be used along with a comma to separate two ICs. Okay, now this rule is true, right? Even when we have DCs, right? Or phrases that appear between the two ICs. Before we get into this, you guys, Let's try this one here. So in this second example, if I say Jack is a boy, comma, he acts like a girl. If I don't have the fanboys and just a comma, is it grammatically correct? No, it's not. Right? Well, why? Because we cannot have a comma or a fanboys. We have to have a comma and a fanboys word though, okay? Now here's the thing. Sometimes the SAT might test you on which fanboys word to use, right? Do you want to use comma for, comma and, comma nor, comma but, or yet, or so? Which one would you use here, you guys? Probably but, right? You wouldn't say Jack is a boy and he acts like a girl. That sounds a little bit off, right? You wouldn't say Jack is a boy so he acts like a girl, right? You would say Jack is a boy but he acts like a girl. Kind of showing you this contrast, right? Between what he actually is, his gender, and how he actually behaves, right? Not like his gender is all, right? So you probably want to use the contrast there, okay? So anyways, expanding on this point, you guys, right, is this rule holds true. What I mean by holds true is that this rule is still correct, is still true, even when we have DCs, right, that kind of come in between these two ICs. So even when we have these sort of extra pieces of additional information that come in between your two ICs, as long as we have the IC, comma, fanboys, and an IC after, right, this is still grammatically correct, okay? So for example, here you guys, is I thought I arrived at the train station 5 minutes before the train was scheduled to leave. That's your first IC, right? Subject, verb, yeah, complete thought, right? IC, comma, fanboys, because, notice how I have a subordinate conjunction now, which creates a DC, right? Because my watch was 7 minutes slow, that's my DC. The train, that's my subject, had already left. Hey, welcome back, team, to your D.SAT Writing Foundations classroom, where I teach you to master the grammar fundamentals to help you go from unsure and stuck to unstoppable, right, on the SAT test, right? Again, I am your coach, you guys, Jin. You guys can just call me Jin teacher or Jin coach. That's perfectly fine. But want to kind of jump right back into today's lesson, you guys, continuing off of the heels of the previous lesson about these comma rules, right? These comma do's and don'ts. We're going to expand on the rules, right, by giving you maybe about 5 or 6 more, right, of these rules that you guys have to learn so well that you make them yours, right? 자기 거 만들어야 돼. Right now, these rules are mine, right? They're not yours yet, right? But they will become yours with more practice and repetition though, okay? So let's jump right into this, you guys, yeah? So another sort of comma rule, and here, we're really going to focus on the comma don'ts. Right? So we focus on a lot of the what you should do with commas or how commas should be used. We're really going to emphasize how we shouldn't use commas. And the reason why I'm covering these, you guys, is because the SAT loves to create wrong answer choices that violate these rules. Now, these rules that I'm about to share with you are not, you won't find these rules in any grammar book, right? So no matter how well the grammar book is written, right, the grammar or the author of that book isn't going to say, hey, this is what you shouldn't do with commas, right? It just doesn't work like that, right? And so these comma don'ts are really important because a lot of the wrong answer choices are going to be based off of these guys though, okay? So the biggest one, I think, is really, guys, you never ever use a comma to separate a subject and a verb. Okay, so if you look at this sort of pattern, in other words, you'll never have one comma that comes in between a subject and a verb is all, okay? So if we take a look at a practical example here we have owners and employees alike were at the business convention. Okay, so remember that first lesson that I talked to you guys about complete subjects, simple subjects, right? This is where complete subjects are really important to identify, right? So if we kind of apply this rule, we'll never have one comma that comes in between a subject and a verb, right? If we apply that rule, right, understanding complete subjects, right, we'll be able to kind of know when this comma rule is violated, right? So what I mean by that is, guys, if you look at the sentence, the complete subject of the sentence is owners and employees alike. That's the complete subject, right? That's the entire group of words that make up the subject of that sentence, right? Now, what's the verb in the sentence? Well, the verb is were, right? So again, if we ever see just one comma that comes in between a subject, right, and a verb, right, it's wrong. It's wrong though, okay? So really, really good to know, you guys, yeah? And this rule holds no matter how long the subject is, right? It's really, really important to know because sometimes, you guys, subjects of a sentence can get really lengthy, right? So for example, here, if I have a sentence that reads, what is interesting about the way Sherlock Holmes solves crimes is that he activates all his senses to do so, okay? So here, if we identify the complete subject of the sentence, that would be, it would start with the word what. Where does it go? What is interesting about the way Sherlock, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, boom, until solves crimes. Okay, now here, it's a really, really long subject. Kind of seems like you want to take a breath. Kind of like you want to pause, right, after reading that subject, right? Well, even though we would maybe naturally pause when we read it, right, we wouldn't put a comma there when we write it, right? Again, that's because it would be violating that rule, right, where you never put one comma between a subject and its verb, right? So the verb of the sentence is, that's the main verb, right? So you'll never just have one comma between a subject and a verb though, okay? Super, super powerful rule to keep in mind. It'll help you to eliminate a ton of wrong answer choices on the test, okay? Now here is a little side note. The only time that you're gonna see commas in between a subject and a verb is when you have two commas. When you have two commas that come in between a subject and a verb, then that's okay, right? So if we look at this sort of sentence structure or this sort of basic pattern, right, here, we can have subject, comma, right, some information, comma, and then a verb, right? So the only, and this is acceptable, this is okay, right? So the only time that grammatically you're going to see commas between a subject and a verb is when you have two, but never one. Because some of you guys already kind of know this term non-essential information, right? Non-essential, just, we'll talk about this in the next lesson in a lot of detail. Some of you guys already kind of know it, right? Have heard the term before, right? And so a common place to put non-essential information is in between your subject and your verb. But when you do this, you can't just put one comma between them. You have to put two though, okay? So that's something good to kind of know. Here's a couple of examples of non-essential information that are used to separate the subject from its verb, right? So I'll just kind of go over one. It says Mark Twain, comma, an American fiction writer, comma. The stuff in yellow is your non-essential piece of information, right? Is considered one of the most iconic writers of the 20th century. So Mark Twain would be your subject, is would be your verb, right? So again, we can't have commas come in between a subject and a verb, but we have to have two, right? Never one is all, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind, you guys, right? Moving right along. Another sort of comma don't, you guys, yeah, is look, you do not want to use commas before or after or around prepositional phrases that naturally blend, put that in bunny ears, right? Naturally blend or belong with the previous information. Okay, so let's kind of dissect this rule, you guys. Yeah, first of all, what's a prepositional phrase? Right, so guys, a prepositional phrase, right, is nothing more than a group of words that begins with the preposition. Remember what prepositions are, you guys? Prepositions are words like in, on, to, for, with, right? There's a ton of prepositions in the English language, but these are just words that really show like direction or location, right? Like under, after, over, in, between, right? Towards, right? Above, right? So on and so forth though, right? So a prepositional phrase is when you have a group of words, right? That begins with the preposition and ends with a noun, right? So if I, for example, if I say in the bathroom, right? Bathroom's a noun, in is your preposition, right? So in the bathroom would be your prepositional phrase, right? If I say under the bed, right? Under the bed would be your prepositional phrase, right? Begins with the preposition, ends with a noun, okay? So this rule is basically saying, you guys, do not use commas before or even after prepositional phrases that naturally blend with the previous information. What I mean by naturally blend with is I just kind of mean like it should be kind of grouped together with, right? It kind of belongs together with the other information, okay? So here's a simple example to kind of illustrate the point. Here, the sentence reads, I was waiting at the bus stop for over 3 hours. Okay, so here, for over 3 hours is a prepositional phrase. I'm going to put PR as prepositional phrase, right? For would be your preposition, right? Hours would be that noun that ends that prepositional phrase, right? So here, this prepositional phrase, you guys, yeah, naturally blends or belongs with this previous information is all, right? So how long were you waiting at the bus stop is all, right? I was waiting at the bus stop for over 3 hours. For over 3 hours naturally blends with the previous information is all, right? So it kind of just specifies, right? It kind of specifies like how long you were waiting for, right? At the bus stop for. You know, so in that case, you guys, yeah, we would not use a comma before prepositional phrases that naturally blend or belong with that previous information. So another super, super powerful rule to know, because a lot of times, again, the wrong answer choices are going to be based off of, right, comma placements in this way, right? So now again, you guys, to kind of further expand on this rule holds true. In other words, it's maintained, right? This rule is true even when you have consecutive prepositional phrases, right? So what that means is even when you have prepositional phrase after prepositional phrase after prepositional phrase, this rule is still true, right? So for example, notice here, you guys, yeah? I'll kind of read, as I'm reading the sentence, I will point out the prepositional phrases by underlining them, okay? So I read an incredible story about a man with 4 kids during a time of extreme chaos in the inner cities of Los Angeles. Can you see? There's a ton of prepositional phrases, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 prepositional phrases in this one sentence. Notice how they're consecutive, right? They're kind of like placed next to each other in succession, right? Back to back to back to back. So even Hey, welcome team to your D.SAT Writing Foundations classroom, again, where I teach you to master the grammar fundamentals so you can go from unstuck and unsure to unstoppable, right, on this new SAT test. Now guys, we're going away from punctuation, although we'll still need to kind of know and apply the punctuation rules, but we're going to go away from like specifically focusing on punctuation rules to now getting into the actual concepts of grammar that the D.SAT tests you on. And one of the most frequently and commonly tested grammar concepts is the concept called sentence structure, right? Now, what I decided to do for this lesson, you guys, for this chapter, is to really break it up into 3 smaller lessons, much shorter than 30 minutes, right? So I want to, well, hopefully, and I want to really see how you guys kind of take to that. So whether you guys like the sort of longer 45 minutes, sometimes even up to like an hour long classes, or whether the shorter type of classes are more suitable for you. And I'd love to hear you guys kind of just write me a message or a comment, right, through the Master Prep platform. Love to kind of hear that, okay? So I'm going to focus on just one of the more common types of sentence structure, one of the most common types of sentence structure errors that you're going to see on the SAT exam, okay? And that's going to be the sort of fragments, though. All right, so before we kind of get into that, you guys, yeah, we really got to talk about what sentence structure is, right? For us to really understand, right, how it's going to be tested. Okay, now sentence structure, you guys, at its core, basically just refers to how the sentence is built, right? So how the sentence is structured, right, is all. Yeah. So when we have sentences that are structured or built correctly, we call those grammatical sentences. Meaning that these sentences, they follow all of the rules of grammar, right? That they behave properly, okay? Now, on the other hand, sentences that are not built correctly, we call these sentences ungrammatical sentences. They're not grammatical, right? Meaning that they break or they violate, right, some rules of grammar. Now, I call these sentence structure errors. Right now on the SAT, you're going to have 3 main types of sentence structure errors that you'll encounter, right, when you do encounter these types of questions, okay? Those 3, really simply put, are called fragments, right? Run-on sentences. And lastly, we have this third category of nonsensical structures. Now, what I'll do is I'll kind of break down each of these types of sentence structure errors, right? And really talk about the different ways that they can kind of show up, right, on the test, okay? So the first type, you guys, right, is those sentence fragments. So you might hear me say the term fragments or sentence fragments or just a not IC, right? They basically all mean the same thing, right? Like an incomplete sentence is all, okay? And that's really what a fragment is. It's not a complete sentence. Now remember, you guys, right? If we really think about this, the foundation of a grammatical sentence, right? The foundation of a grammatical sentence, right, must always contain at least one independent clause in it. It's a really important thing to kind of understand or know, right? Every grammatical sentence in the English language on the SAT is going to have at least one independent clause in it. If that sentence does not have an independent clause, we call that sentence a fragment, right? And that's a sort of sentence structure error that you'll see, yeah, on the test, okay? So just kind of remember that, right? Every sentence that you read or ask a question about, right, must contain at least one independent clause. If it doesn't, then we know that it's a fragment, though, okay? So one of the things that I always do when I read for grammar questions, right, is I read with sentence structure in mind. In other words, when I'm reading, I'm kind of thinking about, right, trying to identify, right, where the complete sentence or the independent clause is. Right now, just by kind of focusing on that a little bit, I'm able to kind of see, right, if the sentence does not contain an independent clause. I can almost always do that on the first try. I can always do that on the first try, right? Up to this point. I can always do that on the first try when I'm reading the sentence the first time through because I've trained my mind, right, to really identify whether that sentence has an independent clause or not, okay? And so it's really kind of important that you kind of read in that sort of way. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail as we kind of go along, okay? But anyways, right, that's what a fragment is, you guys. Now, sometimes fragments are going to be very obvious to you, right? These are like easier questions, right? So if a sentence reads, if I don't eat something soon, right? You're like, well, hey, something's really missing, right? And a lot of you guys identify, right? Oh, this is a dependent clause, right? Because of that subordinating conjunction at the beginning of this statement, right? Which leaves it incomplete, which leaves it a not IC, right? When I say XIC, that just means a not IC, which just means a fragment though, okay? Same thing with running late to the meeting. You guys can all tell, right, that this is not a complete sentence, right? On the other hand, right, sometimes it's harder to identify, right, that you have an incomplete sentence, right? Usually when you have a lot of words, right, in that sentence, okay? So here, for example, we have, on the plains of a remote part of Egypt, archaeologists finally discovered after they dug the ruins for 2 days. Okay. Now, guys, I don't know if you guys could identify this or not, right? But does it kind of sound like something's missing? Right, now here's the thing, you guys, right? Usually when you're reading the sentence and it sounds like an incomplete sentence, when you have a fragment as a sentence, right? When you have a statement that's a fragment, right? Oftentimes you'll be able to kind of tell, right, that something's missing. In other words, like something sounds off, right? Something sounds incomplete, right? Now your brain loves to kind of like complete things, right? And so when you read a sentence and you recognize that something is incomplete, your brain should kind of like signal to you and be like, well, wait a second, something sounds a little bit off. And you can kind of hear it more obviously, right? That something sounds off with these sentences, right? They sound really, really incomplete. They sound like something is really missing, right? It's a little bit harder to hear that something sounds like it's missing in these sentences here, right? But in fact, they are, right? So here, for the second example, right, each page has several questions, semicolon, students have to answer before they move on. period. Can you guys kind of tell what's missing in each of these sentences? And if you guys can't right now, it's okay, right? But this is where, fragments can be a little bit harder to identify, right? So it's really kind of important to know the different ways that fragments can kind of show up on the SAT. So you better prepare yourself, right, to kind of understand precisely, right, what exactly the missing piece is, okay? We'll kind of cover these in this next part. So some common types of fragments that you'll see on the SAT, you guys, right? Really 3 types. Okay, now, again, if you understand what a fragment is not an independent clause, right? Remember what an independent clause is. Independent clause contains a subject, a verb, and a complete thought, right? So if a fragment is not an independent clause, then that must mean that that fragment is missing one of these, if not a combination of these 3 things, right? Either a subject, a verb, and a complete thought, not a complete thought, or some combination of the 3, right? And so those are the sort of common types of fragments that you'll encounter, okay? They can show up in different ways, right? But the first type, you guys, right, is when we have a fragment that's missing a subject, right? So here, common examples, we talked about these earlier. Some of the trickier types of fragments that are missing a subject, right? Some of whom were at the party, some of which is gone, right? Whenever we have what are called relative pronouns, right? Relative pronouns like whom, which, right? Who, that, when, where, whose, W-H-O-S-E, those relative pronouns, right? They create dependent clauses, right? Dependent clauses are incomplete sentences, right? They cannot stand alone as a complete sentence, right? We learned about that in lesson 1. Right, the sort of foundations of grammar, the building blocks of grammar, right? And so here, if we have a subject that reads some of which, or none of which, or some of which, or none of which, or some of whom, or et cetera, right? That sort of combination, this plus a verb. Hey, welcome back, team, to your D.SAT Writing Foundations classroom. So this is going to be that 3rd lesson on verbs, you guys, right? We talked about subject-verb agreement. We talked about verb forms. Now we got to talk about this last way the SAT tests you on verbs, verb tenses, all right? Now, guys, when you get a verb question on the SAT, how I want you to think about or approach the verb question is in this order, okay? So first, right, check for subject-verb agreement. Right, so notice if there's any differences in singular and plural verb answer choices. Check that first. Do not check verb tenses first. If you start thinking about which tense should the verb be first, you're oftentimes going to miss verb questions, right? Because you're not going to see or think about the subject-verb agreement stuff, right? So I want you to think about the subject-verb agreement first, right, before you think about verb tenses, okay? So notice, are there any differences between singular and plural verbs in your answer choices? If there aren't, then cool. Think about verb forms next, right? Like verb forms and sentence structure, parallel structure, that type of stuff. Once you've done that, then you can start thinking about verb tenses, okay? So in other words, guys, when you get verb questions on the SAT, think about verb tenses last. Don't think about it first, okay? That'll help save a lot of, it'll help save a lot of confusion, right? Because verb tenses are the most kind of tricky to kind of figure out, right? Plus it'll help you to kind of like get a lot more questions correct. You won't fall into some traps, right? For some trickier question types though, okay? So verb tenses are basically, right? Hey, should the verb be written in the present tense, past tense, future tense, right? So here, just take a couple of examples, you guys, of sentences and just try to figure out what tense the verb is in. Most of you guys know all of these. Jack runs fast but sings terribly. Present tense, right? Jack ran 12 miles and sang the entire way. Past tense, right? Jack will run 10 miles later today. Future tense, right? My grandma would always tell me to never give up. This is a little bit tricky, but it's past tense, right? It's past tense, right? If you just kind of think about the meaning of the sentence, you know it's past tense, okay? And that's really ultimately, right, what or how verb tenses are being tested, right, is that, which tense do you use, okay? Now guys, so much of which tense is correct on the SAT, so much of that really comes down to context, right? Is the context of that passage that you're given. Remember you guys, context just refers to surrounding information, right? Now so much of you determining which verb tense is correct boils down to, right, the other words, the surrounding information, right, for verb tense questions, okay? So there are two major context clues, like context cues, that you want to be looking out for, right, when you're checking which verb tenses is correct. So that first one, you guys, is what I call time cues. These are going to be like surrounding words that tell you, right, something about what time, what tense the verb should be written in. So for example, you guys, if I say today, I don't want to use past tense, right? I want to use like present tense, or I want to use future tense, right? So if I say today I will run 5 miles, right? Today is a beautiful day, right? Last week, right? Next Sunday, 2,000 years from now, right? These are all time cues since I was a kid. So these time cues kind of will dictate or determine which verb tense you use, okay? And the second context clue, you guys, is other verbs. Okay, so like non-underlined verbs, right? So, you know, you want to kind of check, well, I'll give you the sort of example sentence first. If I say, my favorite food is peanut butter because it pairs with so many other foods to create delicious flavor combinations, right? So here, if this verb is underlined, right, one of the ways to kind of like check to see what tense this verb should be in, do I say present tense is, or do I say past tense was, or do I say future tense will be, right? One way to check is check for other verbs, right, the non-underlined verbs, right, in that passage. Now how I check for these other verbs, you guys, is first, I check for other verbs in the same sentence the underlined verb is in. If there are no other verbs in that same sentence, then I'll check surrounding sentences, right? Either the sentence before or after, right? Maybe a couple of sentences before, right? Something in that context of that passage that'll tell me, right, what tense those other verbs are in, right? So here, the idea is you just want to keep the verbs in the same tense, right? Unless there are other like time cues that kind of tell you to shift the verb tense though, okay? And we'll kind of go over some of these, right, kind of together, you guys, yeah? When we get into the practice section, all right? So in a nutshell, I don't have to teach you all of the 11 verb tenses in the English language, right, for you to kind of confidently get these questions correct in the test, okay? What I do have to get you to recognize though are those the context is really, really important, right? Time cues, right? Other words that indicate time, right? Like stuff in the past, present, or future, as well as other verbs in the context, right? So those are going to be the important things. Now there are two specific verb tenses that you do have to kind of know well, right? Because the SAT can kind of test you on these two verb tenses in kind of tricky ways. Yeah, those are the present perfect and the past perfect tenses. So these are verbs that I will teach you about in terms of some of its most common uses or how they're most commonly used on the SAT, all right? But guys, one thing that I do want to kind of let you know is the present perfect, first of all, for example, can be used in like 10 different ways, right? In just when we're talking about just regular English grammar. But on the SAT, right, you don't have to know all of the ways that present perfect can be used. You just have to know two main ones though, right? Especially this first one, okay? So let's talk about the present perfect tense right now. So this tense, you guys, is created or formed by using either the verb has or have. If it's singular, you say has. If it's plural, you say have. Right? But these are both present tense verbs, right? He has, they have. You pair that verb with the past participle, right? Not the past tense, but the past participle, right? So here you would say something like, you know, has been, right? Have grown, has played, have watched. That's all the present perfect tense. Okay, so the example sentence here says, I have lived in Korea for 12 years. Right now, one of the most common uses, the most common use for the present perfect, you guys, is this way. It's used to indicate that an event started in the past and it continues even into the present. Okay, so this event started in the past and continues even until today. Right, so here, this event, me living in Korea, that event started 12 years ago, and currently I still live in Korea. Right, that's what the present perfect, right, kind of indicates. Okay, if you think about a timeline, you guys, a timeline where here is this point in time is now, and this point in time is in the past, the present perfect is basically just saying that this event, it started here and it kind of continues into the present. It continues into the present day, right? That's basically this use, right, of the present perfect. Okay? There's another sort of use of the present perfect that I want you guys to know, right? And just know that the second use, right, is not, it's kind of like independent, right? It's independent from this first use. I'll give you guys an example to illustrate. So the sentence says, I have met Barack Obama. Right? I have met Barack Obama. So another use, so we have the present perfect, have met, right? So here, another use of the present perfect can be used to indicate that an event occurred at some unknown time in the past, right? So in other words, this event, me meeting Barack Obama, this event happened sometime in the past, but the sentence or the context doesn't tell you, doesn't specify when. It's unknown. So it occurred at an unknown time in the past. Okay? That's the second most common use of the present perfect that you'll see on the SAT. But notice how, right? Hey team, welcome back to your D.SAT Writing Foundations classroom. Again, this is Coach Jin, where I help you guys to master the grammar fundamentals, to take you from unstuck and unsure to unstoppable, right, on the SAT exam. Now guys, we are in the last concept or question type, right, for the digital SAT writing section. This question type, you guys, is called rhetorical synthesis. Don't let the name intimidate you. It's actually a pretty basic question to answer. You just got to make sure to follow certain steps. Make sure just to do the sort of steps really well is all. Anyways, if you guys are wondering, the rhetorical synthesis question, this is like the last set of questions that appears, right, on the sort of writing portion of the test. At the end of the module, maybe the last 1, 2, sometimes even like 3 questions can be like rhetorical synthesis, right? Where they give you like a set of notes and then they give you like a prompt and then they give you answer choices and stuff like that, right? And this is the sort of concept of the question type that I'm going to break down for you guys today. Now, I think first of all, you guys, right, it's kind of important to know what synthesis means. We talked about what rhetoric means, right? Rhetoric is just like the art of writing, right? So it's just like, could be the language that's used. It could be the message that's conveyed with the words that are being used, right? It could be like the order or the organization of information. That's what rhetoric is. But what does synthesis mean? So guys, in a nutshell, synthesis just means a combination. Okay, now if we take the verb synthesize to synthesize, synthesize just means to combine. It means to combine parts, like parts of something, to create some kind of whole. Okay, to create some kind of desired whole. Okay, so if you guys have ever had to like write a sort of book report, right, where you are maybe analyzing a character, right, you are doing some level of synthesis, right, where you are taking information from the book, right, maybe you're taking certain actions the character did in different chapters of the book. Maybe in the first chapter he stole bread, maybe in the second chapter, right, like he became a monk, and maybe in the third chapter he taught people how not to steal bread, right? So anyways, you're taking ideas Like parts, you're taking ideas from different places, right? Like you're taking parts and pieces of stuff and you're using that to create some kind of whole. Now the whole that you're creating when you're writing a sort of character analysis is maybe you're talking about the character arc, right? Like how he went from bad to good. That's the sort of character arc. And maybe you're creating a sort of synthesis of that, right? Or maybe you're creating some kind of synthesis around the character's personality, right? How like personality can change, right? Like what you see isn't always what you get, you know, is all. Maybe you can't judge a book by, you know, its cover, you know, whatever the sort of message might be, right? Anyways, that's what kind of synthesis is, you guys, right? It's like basically where you're combining little pieces and parts of stuff to create some kind of desired whole, okay? Now, what I like to kind of refer to this question as is this. I like to refer to this question as, hey, what is the relevant X to achieve or accomplish some kind of Y? Okay, so I'll also say, because that's really what the core of this question is, right? Like your job is to figure out, right, some relevant piece of information. That'll be the sort of answer choices that you're given, right? What's the relevant X to accomplish some kind of Y, to achieve some kind of goal? And this goal is going to be what's stated in that question stem, okay? Now, what I aim to do in this lesson, you guys, is I aim to kind of like break down the facts and also teach you the strats, right? The facts and strats, yeah? So the first part of this lesson is I'll take you through step by step what you'll experience, right, for this question. And for those of you guys who did take practice test number 1 already, right, you guys already experienced it one time. But maybe you're just like so 정신없어 throughout the practice test, you just probably forgot about everything, right? So I'll kind of walk you through step by step, you guys. So first of all, you're going to see a set of notes, right, that some student kind of wrote in some kind of class, right? So those notes could be a set of these like bullet points, right? Secondly, and usually, guys, these notes, they kind of have some kind of progression, right? They're not just like super random. It usually kind of goes from some kind of like logical order or some kind of like sequence, okay? Next is that they tell you what the student's goal is. So this is where you'll see the sort of question stem, where in the first part of the question, they'll give you what the writer's or the student's goal is. This is what he wants to achieve, okay? So the student wants to achieve this. He wants to emphasize a similarity between the two works. And these two works are the two works that you read about in the set of notes, okay? Now then you first get presented with the goal, and then you get presented with the actual question stem, right? Which choice most effectively uses relevant information from the notes to accomplish this goal? What is this goal? Well, that goal is what the writer wants to achieve, right? He wants to emphasize a similarity between the two works is all, okay? And so basically the third thing, your job, right, what the core question asks you, your job is to figure out which of the answer choices best uses relevant information, right, from the set of notes to achieve that certain goal, right? That's what the question stem is asking you, right? So now you're going to be presented with 4 answer choices. Now the correct answer, right, the correct answer is going to achieve that goal. What's the goal? The goal is, right, the writer wants to achieve a similarity between the two works is all. Right? So the correct answer is going to achieve that, okay? So that's really a sort of breakdown, right, of what you'll experience kind of step by step for this question, okay? Now, in terms of how to solve rhetorical synthesis questions, so this is a sort of step-by-step process, the sort of high-level points, the strat part, right, of the lesson, okay? So the first thing, you guys, is you want to read the notes, right? So when you're reading, right, the notes here, you want to, as you're reading the notes, again, for me, guys, when I'm reading stuff, whatever I do, I love to just do things one thing at a time, right? Process one thing at a time. So when I'm reading this note, right, I'm processing to make sure that I understand this before I move on to this, right? It's such an important part. I feel like students don't give themselves time to kind of process, or they don't do things at a speed that allows them to process stuff, okay? But anyways, you want to read each set of notes and you want to get the gist of each note, okay? The gist is basically like, hey, what's the sort of main message of this note, right? Now, here, you know, if you think about this, what you're basically doing when you're reading each note, you guys, is you're trying to comprehend, right? You're trying to show, you have to show a good level of comprehension, okay? Now guys, comprehension has multiple layers or multiple levels to it, right? So like in one level of comprehension, we have like, hey, understanding what the information is saying, right? Like, hey, what is it saying? So when we say like, hey, this Tubbs is a native Hawaiian sculptor and installation artist, okay? So what it's saying is basically, oh yeah, like he is, like he works as an artist in two different ways, okay? It's kind of like what it means, right? And then also at another level, right, we have, well, hey, what is this information doing? Right? What is the information doing? Right, well here, it's talking about Tubbs, but in what way? Well, it's really giving us information about the work that he does, right? The work that he does, right? That's really another layer of comprehension, right? Really shows the type of artist that he is. Is he a painter? Does he just do one form of art, right? It kind of, that's that sort of other layer, right, of comprehension, right? When you read and understand a set of notes though, okay? And that's the sort of like thing that you're trying to do, right? Is really trying to like get that sort of balance between understanding what it says and understanding what it does as well, okay? Because what I want you to do is as you're reading the notes from beginning to end, right, you're not just trying to get the gist of each note separately from each other, right? But you also want to try to understand how these notes are related, right? Try to understand the relationship of the third note and the second note, right?